The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Alaskan range, carrying a bite that spoke of an early and unforgiving winter. Elias, a veteran whose face was a map of old scars and weathered skin, spent his mornings hauling heavy timber and rolls of thick insulation toward his modest cabin. Beside him, Barnaby, an aging German shepherd with graying fur around his muzzle, watched the tree line with disciplined focus, his ears twitching at every snap of a frozen branch. To the casual observer, Elias was a man possessed by a phantom threat, working with a frantic yet methodical pace that seemed out of touch with the mild autumn air still lingering in the valley. He didn't care about the aesthetics of the landscape. He only cared about the thermal integrity of the walls that protected his world. In the small settlement a few miles down the road, the local residents watched Elias's frequent trips to the hardware store with a mixture of amusement and pity. They saw him as a relic of a forgotten war, a man whose mind had never truly left the trenches and who now viewed the changing seasons as a tactical invasion. Groups of younger men stood outside the general store, smearing his reputation with jokes about his fortress and how he was wasting his pension on extra layers of stone and steel. They lived in modern homes with central heating and backup generators, confident that the luxuries of the 21st century had permanently tamed the wilderness. To them, Elias was a paranoid hermit, a man building a bunker against a sky that had always been predictable. Elias heard the muffled laughter when he passed by, but his eyes never strayed from the road ahead. He had seen what happens when the infrastructure of civilization fails, having survived months in environments where nature was more lethal than any enemy fire. His preparation wasn't born of fear, but of a profound respect for the atmospheric shifts he felt in his very marrow, the subtle drop in pressure, and the way the wildlife had gone eerily silent weeks ahead of schedule. He spent his afternoons sealing every microscopic gap in the window frames with industrial-grade caulking, ensuring that not a single breath of cold air could penetrate his sanctuary. He knew that in a true crisis, the difference between life and death was measured in millimeters and degrees of heat retention. The cabin began to take on a strange, armored appearance, its original rustic charm buried under reinforcements of heavy plywood and stacked cords of seasoned oak. Elias spent hours reinforcing the roof trusses, knowing that the weight of record-breaking snowfall could crush a standard structure like an eggshell. He also focused on Barnaby's needs, creating a raised, insulated sleeping platform for the dog that sat directly adjacent to the wood-burning stove. The dog followed him everywhere, occasionally nudging Elias's hand as if to remind him to take a breath, though the man's hands only stopped when the sun dipped below the horizon. The bond between them was forged in a shared understanding of vigilance, two old soldiers preparing for a siege they knew was coming. While his neighbors were busy planning their annual winter festivals and stocking up on seasonal decorations, Elias was stockpiling hundreds of gallons of kerosene and vacuum-sealed rations. He organized his tools with surgical precision, sharpening axes and testing the tension on his manual pulleys, preparing for a scenario where electricity would be nothing more than a memory. He installed a heavy-duty wood stove with a triple-walled chimney pipe, capable of incinerating even the dampest wood if necessary. Every action was a calculated move in a game of survival that the townspeople didn't even realize they were playing. They looked at his stacks of wood and saw an eyesore. Elias looked at them and saw 60 days of guaranteed warmth. The mocking reached a peak when Elias started building a series of windbreaks made of heavy stone and scrap metal around his perimeter. A neighbor named Miller, who owned a fleet of modern snowplows, stopped his truck one afternoon to ask Elias if he was expecting a Siberian invasion or just losing his mind. Elias simply looked at the man, his gaze steady and devoid of malice, and told him that the mountains don't care about a man's ego. Miller laughed, shaking his head as he drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust that lingered in the cold air like a bad omen. Elias didn't watch him go. He went back to hauling stones, his muscles aching with a familiar, purposeful fatigue. Deep inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of quiet readiness, a stark contrast to the frantic activity outside. Elias had mapped out his internal space for maximum efficiency, ensuring that everything from medical supplies to emergency lighting was within arm's reach. He practiced moving through the darkened rooms with a blindfold, memorizing the layout so he could function if smoke or darkness ever clouded his vision. Barnaby watched these drills with a calm intelligence, his tail thumping softly against the reinforced floor. They were a unit, a closed system designed to endure whatever the sky decided to drop on their heads, regardless of the world's opinion. As November bled into December, the sky turned a bruised, heavy purple that seemed to press down on the valley with an invisible weight. The local news stations began reporting on a massive low-pressure system moving down from the Arctic, but the tone was one of moderate concern rather than alarm. People were told to stay indoors and keep their shovels ready, a routine warning that most ignored in favor of their holiday shopping. Elias, however, saw the barometric pressure plummet on his wall-mounted gauge and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He brought the last of his outdoor tools inside, locked the reinforced steel bolts on his door, and checked his fuel levels one last time. The final night before the storm was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath before a scream. Elias sat in his armchair, cleaning his boots by the light of a single oil lamp, while Barnaby rested his chin on his paws, his eyes fixed on the door. The veteran could feel the shift in the air, a vibration in the ground that signaled the approach of something truly monumental. He thought of his neighbors in their glass-fronted homes and their reliance on the grid, wondering if they could feel the change too. He didn't feel superior to them, only a deep, weary sadness for the lessons they were about to learn the hard way. By midnight, the first flakes began to fall, not the soft, fluttering snow of Christmas cards, but hard, icy pellets that rattled against the cabin's reinforced walls like birdshot. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that quickly escalated into a high-pitched shriek as it tore through the mountain passes. Elias stood by the small, triple-paned window and watched the world disappear into a wall of absolute white. The whiteout had arrived, and with it the realization that the town's mockery was about to be buried under 6 feet of ice. He turned away from the window, fed a single log into the stove, and prepared himself for the long night ahead. The first 48 hours of the blizzard transformed the landscape into a hostile, alien world where the horizon had ceased to exist. Inside the cabin, Elias maintained a strict military routine, waking at dawn to check the structural integrity of the roof and the ventilation of the stove. The heat was consistent and dry, a testament to his weeks of grueling labor, and the thick insulation kept the roar of the wind at a manageable hum. Barnaby remained at his post near the door, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the freezing chaos raging just inches away. While the world outside was being erased, the veteran's world remained stable, governed by the rhythm of fire and shadow. Down in the valley, the situation had deteriorated with terrifying speed, far exceeding the town's worst-case projections. The power grid had collapsed within the first 6 hours as ice-laden trees snapped like toothpicks, crushing transformers and severing the main lines. Miller, the man who had mocked Elias, found himself huddled in his designer living room, watching the frost crawl across the inside of his floor-to-ceiling windows. His high-tech backup generator had frozen over, its internal lines clogged with gelled fuel that was never rated for these extreme temperatures. The thin walls of his modern house, designed for aesthetics rather than survival, were already losing the battle against the sub-zero infiltration. The social fabric of the settlement began to fray as the temperature inside the homes dropped into the 30s. Neighbors who had once shared casual jokes now looked at one another with growing desperation, realizing that their cars were buried under drifts so high they reached the second story. There was no cell service, no internet, and no way to call for the emergency services that were themselves trapped in the drifts. The arrogance of the previous month had been replaced by a primal, gnawing fear that tightened in their chests with every passing hour. They were realizing that the paranoid relic up the hill was the only person who had correctly appraised the threat. Elias spent his time reading by the light of the kerosene lamps, his mind focused and sharp despite the isolation. He rationed his food not because he had to, but because discipline was the only thing that kept the encroaching darkness at bay. Every few hours, he would use a long pole to clear the snow from his chimney intake, a task that required him to open a small, protected hatch in the roof. The air that rushed in was so cold, it felt like a physical blow, a reminder that the environment was actively trying to kill anything that breathed. He watched the snow pile up, realizing that his cabin was becoming a subterranean cavern, buried beneath a mountain of white. Communication between the houses in the valley was now limited to flashes of flashlights through frosted glass, silent pleas for help that no one could answer. Miller's young daughter had begun to shiver uncontrollably, her lips turning a faint shade of blue despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. The realization hit Miller like a physical strike. His mockery of Elias had been a defense mechanism against his own inadequacy. He looked out toward the ridge where Elias's cabin stood, or where it used to be, seeing nothing but a churning void of snow. He felt a crushing weight of guilt, knowing that he had led his family into this vulnerability through sheer, stubborn pride. Inside the cabin, Barnaby suddenly stood up, his hackles rising as a low growl vibrated in his chest. Elias froze, his hand moving instinctively toward a heavy flashlight, his ears straining to hear anything over the cacophony of the wind. There was a sound, a rhythmic thudding that didn't belong to the storm, a desperate, frantic beating against the outer shell of the cabin. Elias checked his thermometer. It was nearly 40 below zero outside with the wind chill, a temperature where exposed skin freezes in minutes. He knew that anyone out there was at the very edge of their endurance, their life measured in heartbeats. He didn't hesitate, though he knew the risks of opening the door in such conditions. He donned his heavy Arctic parka, cinched the goggles over his eyes, and signaled for Barnaby to stay back. As he threw the heavy bolts and heaved against the door, a wall of snow and ice-laden air exploded into the entryway. A figure collapsed into the small mudroom, a shivering mass of Gore-Tex and frost that barely resembled a human being. It was one of the local teenagers, a boy who had been among those laughing at the general store just a week prior. The boy was incoherent, his hands stiff as wood, his eyes wide with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen the abyss. Elias worked with the cold efficiency of a field medic, dragging the boy toward the heat of the stove and stripping away his frozen outer layers. He didn't ask questions or offer words of comfort, he simply focused on the mechanics of resuscitation. He wrapped the boy in heated wool blankets and forced a lukewarm broth between his chattering teeth, watching the color slowly return to his pale face. Barnaby approached tentatively, laying his heavy, warm body across the boy's legs to provide additional thermal mass. The boy began to sob, a jagged, ugly sound that filled the small space, the sound of a worldview shattering in the face of reality. The boy eventually managed to stammer out that his family's roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, and that they were trapped in the basement. He had crawled through a ventilation shaft and wandered for hours, guided only by the faint, flickering memory of where Elias's cabin stood on the ridge. He confessed that they had all thought Elias was crazy, but when the walls started to buckle, his father had told him that the old man was their only hope. Elias listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his mind already calculating the logistics of a rescue mission in a storm that was still intensifying. As the night wore on, the cabin became a theater of quiet tension. Elias knew that if he stayed in the warmth, he and Barnaby would survive comfortably for months. If he went out, he was risking his life for people who had treated him like a community joke. He looked at the boy, now sleeping fitfully under the dog's watchful eye, and then at the reinforced door that groaned under the pressure of the wind. The moral dilemma wasn't about whether they deserved help, but whether he had the strength to provide it. He began to pack a heavy sled with emergency supplies, his decision made not by emotion, but by the same code of honor that had governed his entire life. The rescue attempt began at 3 in the morning, the hour when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb. Elias harnessed himself to a heavy-duty sled loaded with kerosene, thermal blankets, and a portable oxygen tank, his movements slow and deliberate. He tied a high-tensile nylon rope to a heavy iron ring he had bolted into the cabin's foundation months ago, a lifeline that would be his only way back through the whiteout. Barnaby whined, sensing the danger, but Elias commanded him to stay and guard the boy. The veteran stepped out into the screaming void, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb. Visibility was less than 3 feet. The world was a swirling, vertical ocean of ice that stripped away all sense of direction. Elias moved by touch and by the tension in the rope, his breath freezing instantly on his face mask, his lungs burning with every inhalation. He reached the first windbreak he had built, the stone wall providing a momentary sanctuary from the direct force of the gusts. He could feel the raw power of the Alaskan winter trying to pull the sled from his grip, the wind acting like a physical hand pushing him toward the cliff edge. This was the break, the moment where the structural integrity of his body was tested against the structural integrity of the mountain. As he descended toward the valley, the rope went taut, snagging on a buried obstacle that Elias couldn't see. He yanked at it, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the line remained caught in the frozen debris. For a moment, panic flared, a cold, sharp sensation that he quickly suppressed with decades of training. He was anchored to a cabin he couldn't see, stuck in a storm that could bury him in minutes, and his only link to safety was compromised. He had to make a choice: cut the rope and proceed on instinct to save the neighbors, or retreat and leave them to the ice. He reached for his serrated knife, the steel cold even through his heavy gloves. The break wasn't just physical, it was the realization of his own mortality. He cut the rope. He was now adrift in the whiteout, relying entirely on his internal compass and his memory of the terrain he had walked 1,000 times. He stumbled over the roof of a buried truck, the metal groaning under his weight, and realized he was standing over Miller's driveway. He began to dig with a collapsible shovel, his movements rhythmic and desperate until he struck the upper frame of a basement window. Inside, he could hear the muffled cries of a family huddled in the dark, the sound of people who had given up on the world and were waiting for the end. Elias smashed the glass and dropped into the basement, a dark, freezing space filled with the smell of damp concrete and fear. Miller was there, holding his wife and daughter, his face a mask of utter defeat. When the beam of Elias's flashlight hit them, Miller didn't cheer. He simply stared, unable to comprehend that the man he had ridiculed was standing in his home like a vengeful ghost. Elias didn't waste time on a greeting. He began distributing the thermal blankets and lighting a small kerosene heater, the flame casting long, flickering shadows on the cracked walls. The silence between the two men was heavier than the snow outside. The ceiling above them groaned, a terrifying sound of timber under extreme stress. The weight of the snow on the house was reaching a critical mass, and the basement was no longer a safe haven. It was a potential cellar grave. Elias signaled that they had to move, but Miller's wife was in the early stages of hypothermia, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. They had to carry her through the narrow window and into a storm that had already nearly claimed Elias. The break was now a literal collapse. A support beam upstairs snapped with a sound like a gunshot, sending a shower of dust and splinters down upon them. The transition from the basement to the surface was a brutal, chaotic struggle. Elias pushed, Miller pulled, and they managed to get the daughter and wife onto the sled, wrapping them in a protective cocoon of canvas and wool. The wind had shifted, becoming even more violent, turning the snow into a horizontal sandstorm of ice. Elias took the lead, his muscles screaming with a fatigue that felt like liquid fire in his veins. He had no rope to guide him back, no lights to follow, and the sled felt like it was made of lead. He was operating on pure, distilled willpower, his mind focused on the image of the cabin ridge. Halfway up the slope, Miller collapsed, his lungs unable to process the frozen air, his spirit broken by the sheer scale of the environment. He screamed at Elias to take his family and go, his voice lost in the roar of the wind, his body disappearing into the drift. Elias turned back, grabbing Miller by the collar of his jacket and hauling him upright with a strength born of desperation. He leaned his face close to Miller's, his goggles frosted over, and yelled a single command: "Move or die." It was the voice of a sergeant in a kill zone, a voice that brooked no argument and recognized no weakness. They crawled. They didn't walk. They dragged themselves through the whiteout, Elias sensing the elevation change through the soles of his boots. He was looking for the windbreaks, the stone walls he had built that the town had called a waste of time. Suddenly, his hand struck cold stone. He had found the perimeter. He followed the wall, his fingers numb, until he felt the heavy timber of the cabin door. He pounded on it with the last of his strength, his vision blurring, his heart skipping beats. The door swung open, and the warmth of the interior spilled out like a golden light from another dimension. Barnaby was there, barking with a frantic joy, helping to pull the bodies into the mudroom. Elias collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving, his face covered in a mask of ice that made him look like a statue. They were all inside, the boy, Miller, the wife, and the daughter. The cabin held firm, the thick walls absorbing the blows of the storm without a tremor. Elias looked at the people he had saved, the people who had laughed at him, and saw only broken, shivering humans in need of a fire. The break was over. The survival of the house had become the survival of the community. The days following the peak of the storm were a blur of recovery and grim realization. The cabin, once a solitary hermitage, was now a crowded field hospital. Elias's meticulous preparation was the only thing keeping 6 people alive, as the blizzard refused to break for another 72 hours. He managed the resources with a cold, calculated efficiency, measuring out every ounce of kerosene and every gram of food. The neighbors sat in silence, watching him move, their eyes following the man they had once treated as a local joke. The physical consequences of the storm were visible on their frostbitten skin, but the psychological consequences were even deeper. Miller sat by the fire for hours, his hands wrapped in bandages, staring at the wood stove as if it were a holy relic. He had lost his house, his trucks, and nearly his entire family, all because he had prioritized the appearance of security over the reality of it. The silence in the cabin was heavy with an unspoken apology that he didn't know how to voice. He watched Elias tend to Barnaby, the veteran checking the dog's paws for ice sores with more tenderness than he showed the humans. The hierarchy of the valley had been completely inverted. The outcast was now the sovereign, and the leaders were his dependents. The emotional weight of the situation began to take a toll on everyone. The small space, though warm and safe, became a pressure cooker of guilt and gratitude. Miller's wife, recovering slowly, spent her time helping Elias with the rations, her movements hesitant and full of shame. She remembered a dinner party where she had laughed at a joke about Elias's doomsday hobby. Now that hobby was the reason her daughter was still breathing. The irony was a physical weight, a knot in her stomach that made the food Elias provided taste like ashes. They were alive, but they were forced to face the shallow nature of their previous lives. Outside, the world was a frozen graveyard. The veteran knew that many in the lower valley wouldn't have survived. Their homes lacked the structural integrity or the independent heating systems required for such an event. This knowledge sat heavy on him, a familiar burden of being the one who lived while others perished. He didn't feel triumph, only a weary confirmation of his own worldview. He spent his time in the mudroom, repairing the gear that had been damaged during the rescue, his hands moving with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. He avoided the living room, preferring the company of his tools and his dog. Barnaby became the bridge between the two worlds. The dog, sensing the distress of the children, would often lay near them, offering his warmth and a sense of calm that the adults couldn't provide. The children clung to him, their small hands buried in his thick fur, finding comfort in the animal's steady presence. Elias watched this from a distance, realizing that while he provided the physical walls, the dog was providing the emotional ones. The consequences of his isolation were being challenged by the sudden influx of human need, and he found himself struggling with the intrusion of so much raw emotion into his sterile, disciplined life. By the fourth day, the wind finally died down to a moan, and the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating a landscape that was unrecognizable. The snow was level with the tops of the cabin's windows, creating a subterranean blue light inside the rooms. Elias began the arduous task of digging out a tunnel to the surface, a job that required hours of back-breaking labor. Miller joined him, working until his hands bled, desperate to contribute something to their survival. They worked in a silence that was no longer hostile but collaborative, a shared penance in the cold. When they finally broke through to the surface, the sight was devastating. The valley was a smooth white bowl, with only the occasional chimney pipe or corner of a roof poking through the drifts. There was no sound, no engines, no birds, no voices. It was the silence of a world that had been reset. Elias stood on the ridge, looking down at the ruins of the settlement, his breath hitching in his chest. He knew that the recovery would take months, if not years, and that the community he had known was gone forever. The consequences were not just the snow, but the permanent loss of the illusion of safety. Back inside, the family began to talk about the future, their voices hushed and fearful. They had nowhere to go. Their home was a wreck, and the roads wouldn't be cleared for weeks. Elias listened as he cleaned the stove, his face illuminated by the amber glow of the embers. He realized that his role as a protector wasn't over. He had enough supplies for himself for a year, which meant he had enough for all of them for a few months, if they were careful. He would have to share his sanctuary, his peace and his solitude with the very people who had once made his life a misery. The psychological shift in the neighbors was profound. They no longer spoke of their careers, their possessions, or their status. They spoke of the heat of the fire, the taste of warm soup, and the miracle of a solid roof. The superficiality of their previous existence had been stripped away by the frost, leaving behind something more primal and honest. They looked at Elias not as a veteran or a hermit, but as a teacher. They realized that his paranoia was actually a form of deep, sacrificial love for life, a commitment to endurance that they had been too blind to see. As evening fell on the fifth day, Elias sat on the porch he had cleared, Barnaby at his side. He watched the stars come out brighter and sharper than he had ever seen them. He felt a strange sense of completion, as if the storm had been the final exam of his long, difficult life. He had built a fortress not to keep people out, but to keep life in. He took a deep breath of the freezing air, his lungs finally clear of the smell of smoke and fear, and for the first time in many years, the veteran felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with war. A week after the storm subsided, the first heavy-lift helicopters appeared in the sky, their rotors beating against the crisp mountain air. They were the first signs of the outside world, bringing specialized rescue teams and supplies to the stranded valley. When the rescuers reached Elias's cabin, they found something they didn't expect: a small, functioning colony. While other parts of the region were being evacuated in a state of total shock, the people in the fortress on the ridge were calm, fed, and organized. The veteran had turned his home into a command center, and his neighbors were his disciplined crew. The arrival of the authorities brought a different kind of tension, the transition back to a world that didn't understand what had happened in the dark. The rescuers marveled at the cabin's reinforcements, the engineers, among them, taking notes on how Elias had managed to keep the structure from collapsing under such immense weight. They saw the stone windbreaks, now partially visible, and realized they had served as a crucial baffle against the destructive force of the gusts. Elias, true to his nature, gave the rescuers a brief tactical report and then stepped back, allowing the professionals to take over the medical care of the family. Miller was the last to leave. As the snowcats arrived to transport his family to a temporary shelter in the city, he stood on the cleared patch of ground in front of the cabin, looking at Elias. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a deep, respectful nod, his eyes wet with tears he didn't try to hide. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I was a fool." Elias looked at him, his expression softening for the first time, and placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "The mountain is a harsh teacher," Elias replied quietly. "Just make sure you don't forget the lesson. The resolution wasn't a return to the way things were, but the birth of a new reality. The town would eventually be rebuilt, but the culture had changed." The story of the lone veteran and his dog spread through the region, not as a joke, but as a legend of foresight and quiet courage. People began to visit the ridge, not to mock, but to ask for advice on how to prepare their own homes. Elias didn't become a social butterfly. He remained a man of few words, but the wall of hostility between him and the community had permanently dissolved, replaced by a foundation of earned respect. Barnaby, despite his age, seemed to have found a second wind. The dog had become a local hero, a symbol of the loyalty that had helped keep the children calm during their darkest hours. Whenever the family Elias saved came back to visit, which they did often, Barnaby would greet them with a slow, dignified wag of his tail. He was no longer just a hermit's dog. He was a guardian of the valley. The veteran and the dog resumed their quiet life, but the silence of the cabin was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a job well done. Elias spent the following summer dismantling some of the more extreme reinforcements, returning the cabin to a more balanced state, but he never let his guard down completely. He knew that nature's strength was a cycle, not a one-time event. He continued to stack his wood and check his seals, but now he did it with the help of the local teenagers who volunteered to haul timber for him. They wanted to learn the old ways, the discipline of survival that the modern world had tried to bury. Elias became an accidental mentor, teaching them that preparation is the highest form of respect for the world around you. The financial consequences for Elias were significant. He had used almost all of his savings and supplies to keep the others alive, but the community ensured he never wanted for anything again. The local general store, where he had once been laughed at, now had a permanent account in his name, paid for by the families of the valley. He tried to refuse, but they wouldn't hear of it. It was a realistic, quiet exchange of gratitude that avoided the theatrics of a public ceremony, which was exactly how Elias wanted it. He didn't want a medal. He wanted his neighbors to be safe. As the next winter approached, the atmosphere in the valley was different. There were no more jokes about fortresses. Instead, there was the sound of hammers and saws as people reinforced their own roofs and insulated their walls. The ridiculed veteran had changed the architecture of the town, both physically and spiritually. He had shown them that survival isn't about luck or technology, but about the character of the man who holds the shovel. He had turned a moment of potential tragedy into a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. One evening, as the first light frost began to coat the meadows, Elias sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, Barnaby resting his head on his knee. He looked down at the lights of the houses below, seeing the smoke rising from chimneys he knew were now properly swept and maintained. He felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. He had survived the war, he had survived the storm, and he had survived the loneliness. He was no longer a ghost of the past, he was a vital part of the present. The cabin stood firm, a dark silhouette against the twilight, a monument to the man who knew that when the world goes white, the only thing that matters is what you built when the sun was shining. The story of Elias and Barnaby became a part of the mountain itself, whispered by the wind through the pines. It was a story told to children when the clouds turned heavy and the air grew cold. Not a story of magic, but a story of a man who prepared, a dog who stayed, and a door that opened when the world was freezing. It was the resolution of a life lived with purpose, proving that the most powerful thing a person can be is ready. As the sun set behind the peaks, Elias turned and walked inside, locking the door behind him, not to keep the world out, but to keep his home and his heart safe for another year.